So I appreciate your attention this afternoon. It's an honor that I get to share my story and talk about my name, so let's get right into it. This image here is an artist's rendering of the route that I chose to fly around the world in 2014. Now, the solid red line you see is the route that I planned. The dotted red line is the route of Amelia Earhart. And Amelia, as most of you know, but some people need a little refresher on Amelia's family history, right? Amelia, in 1937, along with her navigator, Fred Noonan, attempted a flight around the world. And after setting lots of different records across the Atlantic Ocean and beyond, and being just a record-breaking aviator in general before her flight around the world, she was doing big things. She was a huge celebrity back in the 1930s. In fact, people were kind of hanging on her next adventure. In addition to her flight around the world and her aviation pursuits, Amelia was also a social worker. She was a clothing designer. She was designing luggage to make travel more attractive for women. She was kind of doing a little bit of everything. Sound like anyone in this room? Right? I think we're all that way, right? We are multi-passionate, and Amelia was as well. But unfortunately, back in 1937, about 80% of the way around the world, Amelia and Fred disappeared over the South Pacific. They had just left Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia, and they were making their way to Howland Island, a tiny little island atoll about halfway between Papua New Guinea and Hawaii. They were using celestial navigation, so a star, a point on the horizon, and a sextant, which is like an elaborate protractor-looking device, so that they could triangulate their point in space in 1937. Imagine how difficult that would be. So on the night that Amelia and Fred disappeared, the skies were stormy, and they had had many issues with their radio equipment after departing from Papua New Guinea, and they attempted to make it there. But still to this day, no one knows anything about where Amelia is. Every now and then, you'll see a little news story pop up where they say, oh, we found part of a shoe, or we found part of a plane that may be connected to Amelia. And fingers crossed, they'll figure out what happened to her someday, hopefully during my lifetime. It would give me some satisfaction for sure. However, people seem to think that with this name, Amelia Earhart, that I have some sort of secret info about where she actually is. That's not the case, unfortunately. I'll let all those guys that are out there researching and searching for the plane, I'll let them focus on her disappearance. This story today, though, is about the legacy that Amelia left while she was living, right? What she was living for. I have actually been invited to go out on the ships and search for Amelia, and I've considered it, but it's never really aligned with my plans, and so I'll focus on this right now. So we'll get much more into this route here in a bit, but there's a little more to the story before we get to that. Leading up to this flight around the world and completing a goal like this, I had some pretty huge aviation aspirations, okay? The fact that my family named me Amelia Earhart, sharing the same last name with Amelia, obviously led me into aviation, but nobody else in my family is a pilot. Nobody told me, hey, you better be a pilot someday, other than strangers when they learned about my name. But I don't want you to think there was like a silver platter of cash waiting around for little Amelia to learn how to fly to get eventually into this airplane here, the Pilatus PC-12NG. Unfortunately, that was not the case. But eventually, I did unlock that code to get there. When Autumn and her team told me about this event here and the focus of Tech at the Gap, I love that theme, unlocking potential, because it's true. When we need to get to the root of our potential, of what we're really capable of, it is like unlocking a code that keeps changing all the time, right? It's a variable within our minds to get there to our utmost potential, and it can take a long time to figure it out. And so the story I want to share with you about how I went from just a kid with a crazy name, Amelia Earhart, and a family who sort of gave me a bit of information about it all the way into this cockpit right here. It is quite a story. And of course, tying it to this incredible woman here means that there's quite a bit of weight around this as well. People are very protective about Amelia Earhart, right? She's one of our American heroes. Little kids come up to me all the time, little girls, even little boys. Hey, I did a book report on Amelia Earhart. I heard that's your name, right? Oh, I dressed up as Amelia for Halloween. Or I've been to Amelia Earhart's birthplace. which is in Atchison, Kansas, and it's actually a pretty cool place if you have a chance to check it out. So when my parents gave me this name, Amelia Earhart, and decided to tie me to an American hero like this, their intentions were simply to inspire me. In fact, this little kid here that you see at the center, that's little Amelia, hard worker even back then. Growing up with this name, and parents who, again, just wanted to inspire me by naming me after somebody so influential, was pretty tough. Because while my parents weren't doing much to explain the name or lead me down any certain path, every single adult that I would meet, from my teachers to my parents' friends to anybody out there, would walk directly up to me and say, "Well, your name is Amelia Earhart. You better be a pilot someday." No pressure, right? As a little kid, I'm going, what? I want to be a teacher. I want to be a veterinarian. I want to be this, that. I had a million aspirations. Piloting just seemed a little out of reach for me because I didn't see a lot of female pilots out there. The idea of an airline captain, in fact, is an older white guy, right? With his epaulets, walking through the airport. He's not, inviting young women to get into aviation. So that's why I had to figure all this stuff out. So when my mom and dad found out that they were having a little girl in 1983, I'll share that because I think it's an interesting fact, and I'm 39 years old right now, and I'm the same age as when Amelia disappeared. She was 39 years old. It kind of helps put things into context in 1937. But when I came along in 1983, and mom and dad shared that last name, spelled E-A-R-H-A-R-T, same as Amelia, my mom looked at my dad, Glenn, and says, "Glenn, we have to name our daughter Amelia Earhart." And he says, No, Debbie, if we name our kid Amelia Earhart, she's going to feel like she has to be a pilot someday. And my mom goes, "Well, there's nothing wrong with that." He says, No, Debbie, if we name our kid Amelia Earhart, what if she feels so much pressure from this name that she feels like she eventually has to fly around the world or something crazy like that? Okay, my dad is a very smart man because I have felt that pressure so deeply from this age that I somehow got to the point where I could fly that plane around the world. Still to this day, 8 years later, I honestly can't believe that it all came together the way that it did because my parents had no master plan with any of this. In fact, when my mom suggested this to my dad, he kind of fought it quite a bit because in my family, we never knew exactly how we were related to Amelia Earhart. But when you have that same last name, especially back in '83, before you could hop online for Ancestry.com or genealogy.com and just look it up, right? We weren't hiring genealogists because that house, if you can call it a house in the bottom right-hand corner, is the home that I grew up in, which was a tiny little cabin attached to a trailer that my dad hand-built. So growing up with all of this going on around me and kind of the lack of connection to how to figure all of this out, it's been an interesting path to figure out. But when my mom went out and finally had this little girl growing up with this name, I would ask her more and more, right? How are we related? You guys got to figure this out with me because every person I meet wants to know, how are you related to Amelia Earhart? And I don't have a good answer for that. And my mom would help me as much as she could, but we never actually hired a genealogist. It was always just told in my family over and over again that we were distantly related, or had shared a common relation to Amelia that traced back to the 1700s, and that we were somehow connected. So I grew up with that knowledge, and every adult that would ask me about it, that was kind of the standard response that I gave. And so the pressure built and built and built until finally, in my early 20s, when I was a sophomore at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado, I finally got so sick of every single time someone would walk up to me and say, "Hey, your name's Amelia Earhart. Are you a pilot?" I would say, "Not yet, maybe someday." You can only see that disappointed look come across people's faces so many times before you get your butt into an airplane when your name is Amelia Earhart. And so while I was paying my way through school, paying that full tuition, mom and dad, again, they had already divorced at that point, you guys. They were probably still fighting about the name. So, hey, I'll be honest with you guys. This is a real life story here. I don't want to make it sound like a fairy tale. But they had kind of gone their different directions. And so finally I thought, I got to take a flight lesson. I got to figure this out. So I saved and saved and saved, and I was working as a car hop at Sonic. I was working at golf courses, mowing the grass, planting flowers, so I could get up early and squeeze in as many part-time jobs in my life as I possibly could, because I needed to figure out how to pay for that very first flight lesson. So I scheduled it in Boulder at the municipal airport, and when I got out there to the airport, this was not the plane that we flew in. It was this junky old Cessna 172. Okay, picture a training aircraft with a brown and white paint scheme. Great, right? No wonder women don't really get into aviation. The planes, they need a real makeover here, because I showed up to this thing. Half of the dials inside the cockpit had little pieces of tape that said INOP, which means inoperative. The flight instructor goes, "Don't worry, we don't really need those." Yeah, okay. The flight instructor himself, he was quite crotchety, and it was late afternoon. He'd probably had a bunch of flight students come his way that day and have to go through the motions. And so when Amelia Earhart comes along, he says, "Yeah, sure, you're going to fly around the world someday. Get in the plane." Did a very brief pre-flight exam. And now that I know how to do a real pre-flight exam, I can't believe that I agreed to get in that airplane with him. And he also didn't make it a very friendly place. He wasn't saying, "Hey, here's how you get in, here's how you buckle your seatbelt, just kind of like figure it out, and if you can't, I'll show you." Very, just kind of, he was going through the motions. Same thing happened when we started to taxi down the taxiway and get closer towards the runway. And we're kind of bumping along. We get lined up with that center line. This instructor calls on the radio. We get cleared for takeoff. And we're doing an assisted takeoff with dual controls inside the plane, right? So he makes it feel like I'm actually doing the flying here. And as we start to pick up speed and pick up momentum, for the very first time in a small airplane like that, I felt the wheels separate off that runway. And as that separation grew, for the first time, I could see the college campus that I had only previously been walking amongst in between all the buildings. I was starting to see it from above, right? It put things into perspective. And that lesson for me was the day that it all changed. I knew a couple things that afternoon. Number one, I needed to find a different flight instructor. And number two, I had to figure out how I could do this as much as possible, because flying was just really fun. Well, that enthusiasm and that story of someone named Amelia Earhart learning how to fly got picked up by a couple of the local media outlets in Denver and the Boulder area. And this was back in my early 20s again, and so you can tell by the bare midriff. So when this interview was done with one of the local papers here, and they did a subsequent interview with a talk radio station in Denver, Colorado called News Radio 850 KOA. It's a big 50,000-watt talk station that broadcasts to 38 states, Mexico, and Canada at night. So we're talking a major span on where this information was going. Well, when that came out, and this interview came out, suddenly I was doing interviews with national news networks and morning shows and all these silly little things. And the next Amelia Earhart's learning how to fly, and that's all it was. I was nowhere close to even knowing how to fly an airplane at this point. But one of those interviews that I did along the way allowed me to find a job opportunity of becoming a local traffic reporter on the radio. So the radio station that interviewed me said, "You seem to like to talk, and we have a position where in the middle of the night, you can sit in a studio and do traffic reports for different cities like Phoenix and Seattle and Los Angeles from Denver." And I'm thinking, well, that's sort of strange, and I have to work, the graveyard shift, plus go to school all day. But I thought, this seems like a real job, right? This would definitely help me afford those flight lessons. And I'm so glad that I did, because as I learned my way through those skills of becoming a traffic reporter in the middle of the night, soon the helicopter position opened up at the radio station. And the marketing team, they were no dummies, right? They put Amelia Earhart up in the helicopter. So all the drivers that were in and around Denver in their morning and afternoon commutes on that split shift would turn on their radio, and they would hear, "Reporting live from Trafficopter 850, it's Amelia Earhart," right? And they'd look up, and you'd actually see the helicopter there. So that was a really fun part of my job, and a key part of the story that leads up to this flight around the world. So at that point, I had a real job. I wasn't making much, but it felt like a lot at the time. Again, probably 22, 23 years old. I'd taken a few flight lessons, and suddenly I was just going full steam towards aviation. I thought, if I can afford to do this for the rest of my life, I'm going to figure out how to do it. It was fun. It was exciting. It kept me on my toes. It kept me learning new things. And all I was doing was, thinking about the weather and going out to this beautiful location. And it kept life very exciting. And along the way, towards getting my private license, my instrument rating, which means you can fly through clouds and low visibility, and then onto my commercial rating, along the way, as you can imagine, people started asking a lot more questions about this whole Amelia Earhart thing, right? There's always that factor as well. So I would chat with folks, and they would say, well, you know generally how you're related to Amelia, but how exactly are you related? So I called up Mom and Dad, both separately. I said, hey, guys, we got to figure this name thing out. Any way you can help me hire a genealogist? And once again, both of them said, sorry, honey, money's tight. We can't really help you with that. So let us know what you find out. I think, oh, cool. So once again, I go back to saving mode, and I call up a woman in Boulder who is a genealogist who said, if you can give me some military records, birth certificates, death certificates, things like that, I can piece together your family history and give you a really definitive answer on how you're related to Amelia Earhart. And I said, this is awesome. Perfect. Cost about $500, and it would be a couple weeks. So she did. I got a phone call a couple weeks later and a report that she had created for me where this woman said, yes, Amelia, you are related to the first Amelia Earhart. Your family shares a distant common ancestry traced back to the 1700s, and your family and Amelia's lived in adjacent counties in Pennsylvania. And on and on. She had all of these details. She said, but if we want to say the exact pinpoint connection to Amelia, we need to go into the European records. And I'm thinking, go on. That'll be $3,500. I was already eating ramen 5 days a week, you guys. I was like, I said, so you're telling me I'm related? She said, yes. And when you're ready for that full report, you just come right on back to me. And I said, okay, I will do that. But something about this validation from her, because again, remember, this is early 20s Amelia, just trying to come to terms with this identity, right, of how the heck to be a pilot, be connected to this woman that everybody seems to want to talk about, and just sort of figure it all out. But it led me towards a really intense path within aviation, because I think I had something to prove, right? If I want to think about the psychology of it all, my parents didn't really do much with the name once they gave it to me. They didn't take it very seriously. But me being the overachiever that I naturally am, I think I was like, you know what? You guys aren't going to take it seriously? I'll show you. I am going to take it seriously and become the kind of pilot that could fly around the world and do all of these things that people seem to associate with this name. And so it really spurred me along to bring it all to life. And so we're now going to fast forward to 2012, where all the different licenses had been accumulated, and you kind of get to this point in aviation where you're either going to go down a professional path and become a commercial pilot or a flight instructor, or it's just going to kind of be your hobby. Well, I was there in 2012-ish, and I knew that I could just keep training and training, but I was also, after that radio job developed in the news helicopter, I had also become a television broadcast reporter on the NBC affiliate in Denver, Colorado, and in Los Angeles. I bopped around a lot with some TV jobs because that initial radio position led to all of those opportunities. And so I was kind of going in that direction more. I knew flying would be more of a hobby. But there was kind of a middle ground that I saw, right? Kind of that code that I was unlocking about my name and what I could possibly do with it. I thought, well, if I can figure out a way to creatively take this aviation career in the direction of doing a big project, like a one-time flight around the world, maybe I can create a modern-day flight around the world and get other women interested in aviation, but still keep my TV job. And that's what I began doing in 2012. And within my tiny little apartment in South Denver that was as close to Centennial Airport as I could possibly be, because I wanted to be just minutes away from that airplane as often as I could be, I sat down at the kitchen table and I did what all of you have done with your big ideas. You just start sketching out notes. Big, huge, wild questions that have absolutely no real answer in the context in which they begin. I asked myself, if you're going to fly around the world someday, which way would you go? So what do? You pull out a map. That's where things start. And I started going, okay, here's where Amelia went. Okay, that's a lot of stops. She also didn't finish the flight, so we got to think about the complications of that. We need to decide which airplane to do it in. Would I do it in a Lockheed Electra 10E, like Amelia did back in 1937? That's what a lot of people thought I should have done. There's only one airworthy Lockheed Electra anywhere in the world, so finding parts or replacement parts wouldn't be great. And so I decided to go in the more modern direction. But at my kitchen table, that's where it all started, that flight around the world. And from there, slowly but surely, over the course of about 2.5 years, I built a business plan and approached different companies within the aviation world and beyond. So Pilatus, the aircraft manufacturer of that dream plane. In aviation, you can, fall in love with any type of plane. You can even build your own plane or fly a glider. There's so many directions to go. But for me, I had always been drawn to this beautiful Pilatus PC-12, the aircraft that I showed you earlier, because in the aviation world, it's kind of known as the turbine suburban. It's got a turbine engine, and you can throw anything in the back, and you can land it on a dirt runway, right? But it's this big, powerful beast of an airplane. It's made in Switzerland, and it costs $4.5 million to purchase one new, or it did back in 2014. But this plane is state-of-the-art everything, great avionics, all sorts of ways to navigate and communicate. And so when I thought about the plane I would do it in, and I started thinking about that route, all sorts of complications came up, right? Well, this particular aircraft, you can't fly over an ocean in a plane like this because the fuel reserves aren't high enough. So I thought, okay, well, wonder if I could ever talk a company into maybe letting me borrow a plane and modify it, put a fuel tank on board, right? All the biggest ideas come out in the beginning, and that's where it started. So I approached Pilatus with this crazy, wild plan, gave them the whole idea of how I could show other women how to get excited and interested in aviation and give scholarships out and all of this. And I cannot believe it, but in one of our initial meetings with their marketing team and a lot of their engineers who would be working on this project with me, with having to figure out which route to go on and beyond, I actually convinced them to let me borrow a brand new Pilatus PC-12 NG, which I would pick up in Switzerland and fly back across the North Atlantic in 2012 when it only had 3 hours on the engine. That plane was brand new. In fact, the picture here, I'm going to use the teleprompter here. That picture right there is coming back. I think we were in Reykjavik. So when you fly back across the North Atlantic, you have to go up through Iceland and Greenland and Canada and then bring it back down into Denver because that's where the planes are configured. They take the interior and they make it look like a fancy Gulf Stream inside. But when I picked it up, it was just insulation showing and bare walls, and we were bringing back some cargo to the team there in Denver. So once I had Pilatus on board, which again was very complicated, and I could talk all afternoon about that if you ever want to talk about pitching big companies that really think the world of their fancy airplanes. But at this point, once I had Pilatus on board, then they would start saying, okay, well, maybe we can introduce you to someone at Honeywell who developed the avionics inside the plane. Maybe we can get you to talk to the company that makes the propeller, the company that makes the wheels, right? Suddenly, I was growing this team of people who seemed to really care about this idea of creating a modern-day flight around the world in their beautiful airplane. And before I knew it, I had a team of close to 100 people all around the world who were supporting this mission, building websites and educational programs and all sorts of cool stuff going on. Meanwhile, I was still getting up at 2:30 in the morning, doing the news every day, being on the green screen, talking traffic and weather and all these things. So it was very much a passion project on the side. Kind of figure it out when you can, use your vacation days to get it done, but then keep the job long term. So those were the years that my aviation career really started to ramp up and advance in a really, really fast way. Some of the things I was learning were about, how to think about weather at different altitudes to optimize engine performance if we need to avoid a headwind flying into certain airspace. We were talking about how to fly through complicated, busy areas of airspace. That's the middle upper photo here. That's actually flying over Paris. And when you look at all those different waypoints, those are all the different times that you'll be checking in with different air traffic controllers as you move closer towards your route. Meanwhile, the commercial airplanes that are flying in every direction around you are like United and Delta and the big guys, right? And I'm up there in a single engine airplane with one of the ferry pilots to bring this thing back. So my love for aviation kept growing, and we were getting closer to this possible launch of a flight around the world in June of 2014. One of the other things we had to do was go to open water survival training to plan for a trip like this, because if you're going to fly over the water with a single engine, you need to know exactly what you'll do if that one engine has an engine failure, which is absolutely possible. Even though that plane is equipped with a Pratt & Whitney PT6 engine, which is the most reliable turbine engine out there, it has one failure per every million engine starts. So those odds are pretty good. But with that, you still have to go, and I love the comparison of these two images here, right? Amelia with that smile on her face, going through the same type of training so long ago. And I don't know if you can tell, but I am smiling under that mask. My eyes are squinting. I had so much fun that day. And what you do in open water survival training is expose yourself in a controlled environment to the most wild, extreme circumstances, so that in the event of an actual emergency, you can control a little bit more of that fight or flight response. And we went through this all day long, out in the ocean as well, to figure out how exactly I would respond. So here it is, the plane that I would eventually borrow, 5/8 November Golf. I named it the Silver Lining, right? If you're going to fly all the way around the world through every type of sky condition there could be, there's always going to be a silver lining. One of the goals I set for the flight around the world was to take off before sunrise and land after sunset, because I wanted to see the sunrise and sunset around the entire world. And that definitely did happen, but it required some very short sleeping stretches, because when you're flying eastbound at 270 knots at 27,000 feet, you're crossing multiple time zones. The sun is going against you. So not only was I flying into the sun, we're also speeding through time, right? Kind of going into the future in a way. So those days felt very, very short. Leading up to the trip, I had a lot of complicated decisions to make, as you can imagine. I had to write letters to my family to say goodbye, just in case anything happened. I mean, it sounds kind of extreme, right? But look at what happened on Amelia's trip. Flights around the world take place all the time. Well, not all the time, but a couple times a year. And a few have been unsuccessful, even in recent years. So these were realities that I had to face. Another big question about the flight was about the insurance. How could somebody like me, who had about 400 hours at the time of flight experience before launching on this flight around the world, somebody who didn't have much money in the bank either, I had the support of a lot of people, but how could I cover this flight insurance-wise? Well, Lockton, our insurance provider, which I made a local connection with in Denver by marching in there and showing them my crazy business plan and going, hey, I live right down the street from your main offices here. Can I tell you guys about a crazy project I'm working on? And somehow they got involved. But that $20 million insurance policy required me to have 6,800 flight hours in this airplane before I could fly it around the world. Do you know how old I would be by the time I had 6,800 hours in a Pilatus PC-12 NG? Probably be in my 60s or 70s or even 80s. As a non-commercial, I have a commercial license, but I wasn't a commercial pilot flying every day, and I didn't have a military background. I mean, I had enthusiasm and excitement and all this plan going with Pilatus. And insurance-wise, I knew I needed to take someone with me. It was either take someone with me now as a co-pilot or go solo later in life. People give me a really hard time about that. When I meet them and tell, somehow the flight around the world will come up, I've had people look at me and go, well, you didn't do it solo, so what's the big deal? And my favorite response to them is, oh, tell me more about your last flight around the world, right? When you're doing high-stakes risks and projects, there is a part of all of us, I think, that wants to do it alone, right? That ego of, yeah, sure, I can handle it. But then the reality sets in that you can try to do it alone, but you can't do everything as best as someone else can when you're willing to open up to a team. And so when I looked at the reality of either continuing forward in the Pilatus PC-12 or finding an entirely different, smaller aircraft, starting over and doing it solo, I thought, I'll take a co-pilot with me. Well, I was presented with 3 different options. I said, can I at least find a female co-pilot? They said, There are none in the world that qualify, literally. So they gave me 3 men to choose from. I met up with the first, who was a French ferry pilot, and he was sort of like Pepe Le Pew. And I knew right away that we were not going to be a match for this 18-day stretch, because the first thing he said to me was, here's how we're actually going to do the trip. And I thought, dude, I've been working on this for a minute here. I wanted to pay someone to bring him along as my co-pilot. You would hire someone on a trip like that for a commercial flight. So I finally found the right person, and his name was Shane Jordan. And I was nervous as a woman in aviation, right? Only 5% of pilots are women. So I still get asked to this day if I'm lost when I'm out at the airport walking out to the airplane. Truck will pull up and say, are you looking for someone? I say, yeah, I need fuel in the airplane, so come on, let's get it done, right? So when I met Shane, I thought, boy, he's my last option here, and there's really no one else that will qualify, or else I'm going to have to go a whole different route. And when I met him, he was so respectful of what I had done. He asked so many questions. He was so supportive. And when we first climbed into the cockpit together, he looked at me and said, Amelia, I don't know how you pulled this off. I am here to back you up, but this is your flight around the world. And I thought, wow, that is a supportive co-pilot. And so Shane and I were ready to launch in 2014 to fly this route, 27,000 miles, 28,000 miles through 14 countries. And look at that stretch between Australia and the US. I mean, that's a lot of ocean just staring out at the blue. But leading up to the launch of the flight around the world, I encountered some major turbulence. And it didn't happen when I was up in the sky flying an airplane. It happened actually on the ground. And that's the real story I want to tell you guys today, because that's where real growth happened. Sure, it happened in all those flight lessons and all those hours of planning, but this really changed everything. In advance of the trip, I got a call from the Today Show. And they said, hey, Amelia, we're going to have you on the show. You fly out, we'll do a quick interview, you'll be back in Denver in no time. Well, I mentioned that I was working at the NBC affiliate in Denver, and the Today Show is obviously an NBC affiliate as well, and so there was a bit of a connection there. And my whole station was watching back in Colorado when I was on the show that day. Natalie was doing the news. Al Roker was doing the weather. Carson Daly was there. Matt had the day off, which was totally fine by me. But in this interview, they asked all the typical questions, right? Where will you go? Which kind of airplane will you fly? Tell us about the scholarship program. And of course, the question came up, tell us how you're related to Amelia Earhart. It always comes up. So in that interview, I answered exactly the same way I always had. My family shares a distant common ancestry, traced back to the 1700s, in adjacent counties in Pennsylvania and all of this. I said, but I don't know the exact pinpoint connection of how we are related. And they said, well, that's totally fine. You know, we think your flight is great. We'll be following you around the world. And I left, floating on Cloud 9, back to Denver, on the back of a United flight. And when I got there, my phone was absolutely blowing up. A mixture of saw you on the Today Show and things like that. But then I started to see more and more negative popping up in my phone, and my Twitter notifications were reading things like, you're a fraud, you liar, I can't believe I've been following your journey. You're trying to latch on to Amelia Earhart. And some of the worst messages were reading things like, I hope you crash into the ocean and die like the first Amelia did. I love Twitter. It's such a friendly place. I thought, okay, something is going on here. One of the calls I had was from my news director, like the big boss at my NBC station in Denver, and he said, Amelia, we got a problem. We have reason to believe that you lied about your relation to Amelia on your Today Show interview, and we need to talk immediately. So I'm panicking. I'm thinking, what are you even talking about? Lied about it? I said the same thing I've said a million times when I tell this story about what I'm about to do. Well, when I got to the TV station, I found out that one of my co-anchors, who I had anchored the news with many times before, sitting at a desk about this big, he, who considers himself an amateur genealogist as a hobby, weird hobby, but okay, had looked into my family history on his own time, and without telling me, when they showed this clip from the Today Show on our local NBC affiliate, and the female anchor said, "Oh, we're so proud of our Amelia. We can't wait to follow her flight," he chimed in and said, "Well, I looked into it. She's actually not related to Amelia Earhart at all. We'll have another check of the weather at 6. And that was it. And then he went on Twitter, and he posted what he had found out about my family history. So suddenly, I was being mocked and made fun of from every single stranger. It was trending on Twitter for a minute because of this connection to this American hero. And I'm going, what is going on here, right? I've got this report. He's got totally conflicting information. He also could have just come to me in the newsroom and said, "Hey, you should probably look into this." But no, he did it in front of like 5 million people in Denver on the 5 o'clock news on a weekday. So suddenly, everything was up in the air for me. And my bosses came to me and said, "Amelia, you have to figure this out, so get it done immediately." So this time around, I had a little more cash in the bank, and I called up a genealogist at Ancestry.com, and not to get the $19.95 a month deal. This was like a real fast-tracked search, because the researcher I worked with had actually seen it happen on the show, and he said, "Amelia, I'm going to figure this out for you. Whatever, just give me some time." And he was really into it. I felt like he was really on my side, and I kind of needed that at that moment, because I'm kind of questioning my entire identity at this point. Well, a couple of excruciating weeks go by where I'm being mocked and made fun of every single day while I'm on the news in the morning doing the traffic and weather, and then I'd step off camera and I would hop on my computer, and the Today Show would be doing an update about that girl they had on the show that was named Amelia, flying around the world. They actually ran one of those polls where they said, "Vote now. Do you believe her that she didn't really know?" And I'm like, oh my gosh, what is happening? I'm embarrassing everyone, including all of these companies that had partnered with me, 28 different corporate and nonprofit partners around the globe. Plus, I had drilled a hole through the side of that $4.5 million airplane to install a 200-gallon auxiliary fuel tank that would allow me to cross all the oceans I needed. So there was a lot on the line. So while I waited and waited and waited for this researcher to come back to me and give me some news, I just had to endure all of that. And when the phone call finally came through, I excitedly answered, and I could hear it in his voice right away that this wasn't good. He said, "Amelia, I tried as hard as I possibly could to connect you in some way to the first Amelia Earhart." He said, "What probably happened, though, is she kind of saw you coming. She could connect you close enough in a certain direction with Amelia's family tree, but ultimately, when I went into those European records, the branch went this way." He said, "What she probably wanted to do was upsell you for more research to eventually get to no connection to Amelia." And I felt punched in the gut. I was mad at my parents at that point. I thought, how dare you name me Amelia Earhart with no information and just a general, like, hey, handle it however you want. Those angsty feelings were coming out in me. I thought, I wish I'd never even seen an airplane. Why did I do all of this, right? I was questioning it all. And I did think about canceling the entire flight. I thought, I don't need to do this. I don't need to be mocked and made fun of for something that I had done with so much of my heart and been so genuinely involved in it. Well, luckily, I decided in one of my lowest lows to call up one of my mentors who had been a real help on my planning of the flight. And I said, "Tom, what am I going to do? I'm embarrassed." I said, "I didn't know this, but I certainly have no say in it. I can't change this new information." And he said something so critically important to me that changed the entire trajectory of my flight plan. He said, "Amelia, I think it's time that you stop worrying about being related to Amelia Earhart, and you start relating to Amelia Earhart." I thought, oh man, you're right. When we choose to relate to someone or something, that's something we can control. We can't choose who we're related to, the family we were born into, the name we were given. That's just all by chance, right? But if we choose to relate to someone by choosing to act more like them, that gives us permission to be whoever we want. I thought, what's more related to someone than emulating the way that they lived their life? And Amelia was a boundary pusher. She wasn't just doing what people thought she should do, right? There were plenty of news anchors back in her day saying, oh, you don't deserve to do this. And so, in that critical moment, I created a new flight plan. Same kitchen table, different house. I sat down and decided what to do next, and that was to call up every single one of my 28 corporate and nonprofit partners all around the world, some of which were like the top permission giver. And I told them the exact same story that I just told all of you. And I'm so proud to say that every single one of them stayed on board because they knew the character of the person who would put that flight together. The name and that chance connection to someone famous really wasn't what a flight around the world was all about. It was because doing it would be your choice, choosing to be related to a concept that you find interesting and want to do more of. And so I did complete that flight around the world, and I'm so proud to say that Shane and I climbed into the cockpit in Oakland, California, and flew eastbound for 18 days, got to know each other. We had never flown together before that trip. We got to know each other in flight, exploring the entire globe around the equator. And so now, I want to shift things over to you guys. We're going to go through a little bit of flight school here. It won't be too tough because these are all just little mindset shifts, little ways of thinking like a pilot that I have found after going through that really public turbulence. I found that when I'm up in the airplane, things just make sense, right? We use process and procedure and checklists. We make data-driven decisions. We don't just go by our emotions, right? We go by the facts and we back up and we use redundancy. So these flight lessons here are all about how to take a pilot's perspective on the turbulence that you may encounter. And the first one is how to consider all directions. So I want you to think back to the very first time you ever held a compass in your hand. Just a traditional little compass, right? First thing you do is you want to see if it aligns with north. Then you shake it up, and you do it again, because you got to test. Kids today will look for the battery or the plug or the computer chip, or go where's the rest of the iPhone? But we all know that that little compass will always align with true north because the magnet at the center of it is drawn to the magnetic core of the Earth, right? It's that simple. Well, that analogy of following true north has become such a big part of our language, especially here in the US, right? We're supposed to have a gut decision at all times, right? Follow your true north. I think that's fine and well for our values. You want to have a true north value that you stick to all the time and are pulled to? Absolutely. But in decision making, I really want to urge you to start thinking about the different directions on your personal compass that you can take besides just true north. Because as a pilot, it's pretty rare to fly true north. In fact, when it happens and I look at the GPS and the little digital read, I'm like, oh, hey, look, that's weird. We're flying north. Because it's just one of 360 different headings on that compass. So when I was faced with storms that felt like they were slathered across the entire compass in every direction, when I found out I wasn't related to Amelia and the whole world felt like it was mocking me, people on social media were trying to get me canceled to the nth degree, right? I couldn't see blue skies anywhere in my world until I started thinking, okay, if I can't go this direction the way I wanted, being related to Amelia, what's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite is cancel the flight. That's the most opposite decision. Well, what people don't realize is that when you find true north, the real value here is that it actually unlocks complementary headings on your compass. From true north, we know our opposite. From there, we can find halfway points, ways to find paths that not everyone else is taking. Those unusual headings, like a heading of 027 and then switching to a heading of 053, those aren't north, south, east, west paths that maybe the internet will tell us when we search for a solution to a problem online. I know that I do that, and I think, okay, someone will give me advice. But it's always the unusual headings, those things that will take you so far off course that if you can figure out how to do it still with success and navigate along the way, you can continue to make those heading changes no matter what storm pops up in your path. And that unique heading will be so distinctly your own that no one else will be able to confuse it with anyone else's journey along the way. Another way that I use this to come up with a solution, even though I didn't really know I was doing it at the time, was to present Pilatus, the aircraft manufacturer, with the calculations for the possible installation of a 200-gallon auxiliary fuel tank that would allow me to cross any ocean on the entire planet. And we all know how the Swiss feel about their watches, right? Think about how they feel about their airplanes. They're like, these are perfect. Why would you ever want to modify our plane? But when I presented this as an opportunity in aviation to show the possible capabilities of the Pilatus, along with doing it in a unique experimental categorization with the FAA, it would make things more complicated. It would make it a little bit more daring, right? We could have gone multi-engine, but I wasn't there as a pilot yet. I was a single-engine pilot, so let's do it this way. And they finally said, actually, the numbers make sense. Let's do it. And afterwards, even though they ripped the fuel tank out before I gave the airplane back and then they sold it to a customer, one of the biggest compliments that we received was a call from the South African Army. They said, hey, we want to know more about that fuel tank that Amelia used. And I thought, that's pretty cool. So flight lesson number 2 is all about calculating your weight and balance. I think each of us have a personal weight and balance calculation each and every day, right? Whether it's too much baggage that we're carrying when we could be spreading the load and sharing it with others, whether it's not showing up with enough fuel for our journey, right? Or maybe even interior, we're not placing things inside of our aircraft appropriately. When a plane is out of configuration and out of balance, you can actually impact your ability to fly at full capacity. So when we think about the 4 forces in flight that are always in opposition with any aircraft that's flying out there, it's always these 4: lift, gravity, thrust, and drag. Okay, well, if all 4 of these were in perfect balance, in a state of equilibrium, that plane would be, its center of gravity would be in the exact center. And that's kind of a hypothetical situation, right? You want to strive for this state of equilibrium, but a plane is rarely flying in straight and level flight. And that's because the forces outside of the airplane that we can't control, the weather that we want to fly through, will often be filled with headwinds. When a headwind showed up on my flight around the world, I knew I needed to burn extra fuel to fight through those winds. That's extra energy, which means my range is so much shorter with those strong headwinds. But with the proper planning and research, we can understand the environment around us and plan to sort of make do even when things are completely out of alignment. And I really urge you all to think about yourself like this airplane. And when things feel a little out of balance, like, oh, I don't have enough fuel to get through whatever I need to accomplish, or the headwinds feel really strong, just remember that that perfect state of equilibrium that we want to feel, that nice calm, it's very rare, just like in an airplane, very rare for that straight and level flight. But one thing that I think we can control outside of the airplane is a tailwind. A tailwind in a plane is often when a pilot on your Delta or United flight or whatever, when a pilot will announce an early arrival in whatever city that you got to, that's usually because there was a tailwind, and they flew into the airspace where that tailwind was possible, and it got them there faster and with less energy burned. Down here on the ground, we can be a tailwind to one another, especially at a conference like this. I know you guys have been swapping business cards and swapping emails, so when you leave here, be a tailwind by following up on that connection. If you made a promise to connect or to reach out, do it, because those tailwinds can advance someone else's journey with just a little less effort. And that means more fuel to use elsewhere. Flight lesson number 3 is all about preparing for obstacles. I mentioned earlier that I had to go to open water survival training, like all pilots and flight attendants do if they're going to be flying over the water. And this is a look at what that facility in Groton, Connecticut looks like. It is so cool. The pool is designed to have thunder and lightning built in, so the lights go out and it's crashing and there's lightning flashing around, and they dunk you in this fuselage, flip it upside down so that you have to learn how to get out of your harness and use touch points under the water while your sinuses are flooded, you're getting your crew members out to make sure that if it happens in the real world, you've had a few times to practice. And what was so cool about this is that by the end of the day, you're just kind of laughing, getting through it, and you're going, oh, that one was so much faster than the last time, right? So when Shane and I would be out there over, let's say, the Atlantic Ocean between Natal, Brazil, and Dakar, Senegal, that was the first real ocean crossing without anywhere else to land. When we passed our point of no return, which was 80 nautical miles offshore, so the point of no return, I know it sounds extreme, but also cliche at the same time, but in aviation, it is not cliche at all. That's literally the mathematical calculation of the point at which, if I have an engine failure, I can no longer turn the plane around and glide back to the edge of the runway. 80.1 nautical miles, you're going down in the water. So at 80.1 nautical miles, the Pilatus starts making some really strange noises. And Shane and I are like, you heard that one before, huh? But the fact that we had been through this training allowed us to use those checklists and survival techniques to talk to each other. And we would rehearse them and say, okay, let's say worst case scenario while we're flying along. We would just talk about this between our radio calls. What would we do right now? And it became such a comfort to talk about the things that we feared the most in those high-stakes environments. And I think we can all do that here on the ground as well. We've all got phones and laptops. Pop them open and research the things that we fear the most. Because often the fear of what it's possibly going to be like is way different than what it will be like in reality. I'm very grateful that I didn't have to test this out. But when we have the ability to find out what others have done and also to assess how realistic our emotions are around that fear, I think we can get a little closer. That's a version of stretching our wings, right? Pushing it a little further in a controlled environment. This is what it looked like out on the water when they dump you out of the boat and they toss you a raft. You have to open up the raft, and of course mine opens face down. So now I've got to flip the thing over. There's a small craft advisory that day, so the water's sloshing around. I'm very afraid of the ocean. You have to pull this string from the center of an 8-man life raft, and it, of course, falls on top of me, right? And then you slide inside, and they tell you, break open the gear. Just learn how to use it, the flares, everything. So get really close to the things that scare you. As I finally wrap up here, and then we're going to open it up to any Q&A that we may have, I want to share probably the most exciting idea, I think, that I've had from the flight around the world, kind of that aha moment of, this is why the flying stuff kind of lets it all click into place and feels like it has so much context. I think for any of us, if we're going from point A to point B, use whatever form of goal setting, transportation, just picture it in your mind. You want to go from here to here. You can either ride along from here to here as a passenger, along for somebody else's ride, right? You're looking out the window, you might be complaining about the bumps, but your job in a passenger role is just to sit there and be quiet. That's the way that I think I want to spend the least amount of my life, right, as a passenger. Sometimes we have to be the passenger. Those times, just enjoy it, but try not to be too much of a pain. The second role, though, that I think we should spend a little more time in is as pilot in command. That's a pretty easy one. When we're thinking as pilot in command of how to get from here to here, we have our hands on the controls, right? We can make heading changes. We can call for more information. We can be pilots and do our job. But there is an even more powerful position to think of things from in terms of how to survive the turbulence that may pop up along your route from here to here, and that is from the perspective of air traffic control. Okay, when air traffic control sees the Pilatus PC-12, the aircraft I flew, when they see it on a radar screen, they just see a dot that identifies that I am in a Pilatus PC-12, which means I can go up to a certain height, I can go up to a certain speed. And when they give me directions, they aren't going, hey, Amelia, how you doing? Do you think you could maybe change altitude? Because we've got some traffic coming your way. No, they don't care. The little things from that view above, they're looking at the big picture strategy of how to keep things safe. And I think when we can do the same in our own minds and zoom out from our perspective, detach our observation a bit to see ourselves in a big airspace, how can we make it through? What are those big picture changes, the big swings we can make? It allows all the little angry things, the team issues, the little stuff falls away when you think big picture strategy. Because when I was imagining myself going through all that junk with my name and my identity, one of the biggest shifts was when I said, okay, if I was reading the news one day and I saw that a woman named Amelia Earhart did all this flight training and raised all this money and did all this stuff, but she just learned that she was not actually related to Amelia in this really strange way. Would I tell her to cancel her flight around the world? No. I would say, that guy's a jerk. Figure it out. You know how to do all of this. Keep the flight together, because if you can't handle turbulence on the ground, you probably can't handle it up in the air either. So I urge you all to zoom out and see yourself amongst your airspace when things especially are turbulent. So when I arrived back in Oakland and Shane and I landed there was a crowd of about 300 people. We had just crossed the longest stretch of ocean anywhere in the world between Hawaii and California. That's the longest stretch anywhere that a plane can fly. And we were the first Pilatus to ever land in Hawaii because we were the first Pilatus that had ever had a modified fuel tank inside. When I touched down, my mom was there talking to NBC Nightly News going, "I taught her everything she knows." My dad, on the other hand, already had a tear in his eye. He was stressed out. He was supportive of my trip for sure, but he also had very complicated emotions around the name, as you can imagine. He said, "You have no idea how hard it was to watch my daughter go around the world as a tiny little red dot on a map." And I said, "Well, actually, I do, Dad. Let me tell you all about it." And to this day, we're still kind of getting over that, right? Because I think my adventurous side probably reminds me a little too much, or reminds him a little too much of my mom. And so this setting here in Oakland was when I had seen them together for really the first time in my life. And I had a lot of complicated emotions on final approach as well. And all I knew was that someone needed to stand between those two because they were probably going to argue about the name again. Luckily, I got to reunite with both of them, but the other person that I reunited with was a pretty incredible part of the story as well, and his name was Captain Tinarello. Okay, this gentleman here, a couple weeks before I launched on this trip, he reached out to my team and said, "Hey, Amelia, I have access to the same hangar that Amelia Earhart kept her aircraft in the night before her journey in 1937. Do you want to put your plane in there?" I said, "Yes, I do." He had the Civil Air Patrol Museum, which the Civil Air Patrol is kind of a civilian branch of the military that searches for missing aircraft over the land, not the water, but he had been a member of Civil Air Patrol and ran the museum, had the same bedroom that Amelia slept in, and left it exactly as it was when she left. And he said, "I want to show you this room before you go." He had all these surprises planned. So on the day of the trip, Captain Tinarello walked up to me and he said, "Amelia, I got another favor I need to ask." I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to take something on the flight with you." And I'm like, "Oh, weight and balance, everything's final." He said, "Calm down, it's just a patch." Okay. So he, out of his pocket, gets this tiny little patch, and on it is a Lockheed Electra, and it says Amelia Earhart and his squadron number. He pulls out a second patch. So he says, "I have these two patches. You're going to take one around the world, and I'm going to keep the other. And when you get back from your flight around the world, let's swap patches." And I thought, that is the sweetest thing I've ever heard. Give me the patch. So I put it in my insurance book right next to my left leg, and it stayed there around the entire globe. And on final approach, in all my tears, and I'm losing my mind because I don't want the trip to end, but I'm also so ready for it to be over, all the emotions, we can see that Captain Tinarello is standing there with my parents. We can see it all in the distance. And Shane goes, "You better find it." I said, "Oh, I know where it is." So as we got out of the airplane and I reunited with Mom and Dad, I walked over to Captain Tinarello. I don't know who was calling him on that Bluetooth, but he never took that thing off. It was so adorable. I walked over to him, and as the news crews are rushing in, the cameras are there coming at me, I said, "Hang on, there's something I got to do." And I walked over to Captain Tinarello and I said, "Sir, we made a deal. You got your patch?" And he said, "I do." And we swapped in front of everybody, and he gives me this really big hug. And as I lean away from him, his blue eyes are just welling up with tears. And he said, "Amelia, there's something I didn't tell you when I gave you that patch 18 days ago." And he looked at me with those big blue eyes, and he said, "What I didn't tell you is that my whole entire life has been devoted to aviation. When I was a little kid, every airplane that flew overhead, I was obsessed with where it was going and where it flew and who the pilot was and how fast it was going." He said, "So I became a pilot, and I have run the Civil Air Patrol unit here at the Oakland Airport my entire life." He said, "But what I didn't tell you is that when I was a really little kid, I found out that in 1937, Amelia Earhart was about to take off on her flight around the world from right here at the Oakland Airport." He said, "I was standing in this exact same spot, and I watched her take off. I have been staring out at that horizon for 77 years, waiting for her to come back to me, and you just brought her home." And to me, that's what it's all about. the greatest adventures that we'll go on, they all come down to those personal human connections and who we choose to relate to. Thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you all so much for your attention. It means the world to tell my story in that way, so thank you. I want to open it up to any questions before we wrap things up and head it back to Autumn. So, oh, yes. Oh, do you want to ring the mic? Yes. We have a microphone since we're recording.
I'm coming back. Brian, do you have this one? Check. There we go.
Please don't be mad at me.
Oh, boy.
Do you have any desire to go to space?
Of course I do. I am nowhere near qualified, but yeah, someday if the opportunity came up, I think I would go. I don't have the desire to fly around the world again necessarily in an airplane, just because that is something that was a different part of my brain. I still love flying small airplanes, and I think aviation will always be a part of my life, but that was sort of a check it off the list kind of thing. But yeah, I'll definitely be up there. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I was just wondering if you had any ideas how to encourage more women to get interested in to STEM.
Oh yeah, that's like the question of my life, right? It's when I think women are shown all these careers in STEM, right? Our initial response is, wow, that looks like fun, right? Why wouldn't we be interested in these things? And then we walk into the reality of what it's like, and it can be a little different, right? That magic goes away, and we realize just how hard it is. But what I have found is that maintaining exactly who I am, not, making myself more masculine in environments when I'm around different areas in my life that have definitely more males than females involved. I try not to change. I try to bring my perspective. And the thing that I love sharing with all the young women I've worked with through the years is that the airplane has no idea whether or not it's being flown by a man or a woman. It only knows if it's being flown correctly, right? And that's an invitation to keep my standards really, really high. And as a woman, I knew that I was being watched very carefully by a lot of men in aviation. They were often the rudest and most critical on social media during my flight around the world. So the support would have been nice, but I think having that idea that, look, it just comes down to the accuracy and the intention of which you're going to train with, and it kind of invites everybody. So I hope we can head more in that direction. But one of the most beautiful moments from the flight around the world was over Howland Island, which was where Amelia and Fred wanted to land, but they disappeared in that area. We used that opportunity. The autopilot on the plane had a function where I could choose one exact latitude, longitude, and it would fly a perfect circle around that point forever. It would just go on until we ran out of fuel. Well, we set it up, and I used this little handheld GPS device to tweet out the names of 10 young ladies all across the U.S. They were 16 to 18. Each one of them got $7,500 to learn how to fly, and they all became pilots. And that was a really cool moment in the trip, because to be out there on an adventure, sharing that, and that was also the point in the trip where I kind of tried to let go of that anger that I had around how the name thing had worked out. And it really gave me a lot of freedom just to say, put it right back into aviation and just keep on flying. So, thank you. There you go. Thank you.
That talked about, don't let your past stuff limit your destiny. And yeah. I just really think that, you're doing a great job. So my question is what's next? What's your next big, flight around the world adventure?
Yeah, thank you for asking. The next flight around the world, and I don't mean to be a disappointment here, but the next flight around the world is the book. Because flying an airplane was easy compared to writing a book, I have found, but I finally got through it. And that, to me, is going to be sort of the next stage, because while I get to tell this hour-long version of the talk all over the place now, and I love public speaking, I think that, to me, is going to really validate a lot of the just how difficult it was to do it, right? The specificity, the hurdles to overcome in aviation, and so sharing that story. And then, I don't know, I've been painting quite a bit. I took all the aerial photos and started figuring out how to paint them because I'm obsessed with looking out airplane windows. I mean, I'm glued up against every window seat on the commercial flights too, because I just think there's something about the way our brain sort of soaks things in when we get that perspective shift. So, yes, thank you for asking. Oh, God, Autumn, you're going to get your exercise today.
Oh, my gosh, you guys. Come on, can we just ask the questions in order here? Come on. No, I'm just kidding.
You just mentioned that you like looking out the plane window, and I was wondering during your entire speech, when you were doing your flight around the world, was there anything you saw out the window that just like took your breath away and you think about it all the time?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of had this like emotional response, which is not a great place to be as a pilot, but I'm also like a dreamer and an artist, right? And so I'm like, I can't believe this is happening, right? It felt very monumental the whole time. And I luckily, having Shane in the plane with me too, not only was it great confidence and having a team to work with and just in a really dangerous environment, I could also talk about those things with him. And so the storms that we went through, I've got thousands of pictures from the flight, and those are going in a photo book as well. But it was the way that a cloud will change as you're progressing and the light is changing, and the way it kind of changes and evolves when you move past. I wish I had a time lapse of the whole thing. But that's one of my biggest regrets, actually, from the trip, is not documenting it better, because I was so busy with the training and flying and planning and all this that I'm like, cameras were sort of an afterthought. I caught as much of it as I could, but I would love to somehow recreate the flight in a way where I could see it again, but without all the consequence and the involvement of the trip. But yes, the views from above, especially in areas where the tropical zones where you can see every different gradient of an entire color spectrum just because of the way the light changes, it was so artistic from up there. So, yes.
Did you fly to Cumberland?
I did not. No, but line of sight, I saw you guys at some point, maybe coming back from the North Atlantic. I do want to come back, though. This is so beautiful. I was working upstairs, staring out at the lake this morning, and just so grateful to be here with all of you. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being involved, and I just wish you all the best of luck. And blue skies.